He walked into the courtroom in a worn military jacket. No lawyers, no entourage, just a quiet presence that made everyone sit straighter. The billionaire at the defense table laughed when he saw him. But when the veteran spoke, the room fell silent. And by the time the trial ended, the billionaire's smile was gone, and the world would never forget what this father did next. The wood-paneled courtroom of the United States Federal Courthouse in Manhattan had seen its fair share of scandals, politicians, celebrities, hedge fund criminals. But today, something was different. The silence felt thicker, like the marble columns themselves were holding their breath. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Chairs scraped, heels tapped. Lawyers, clerks, spectators all rose in a coordinated wave of obedience, all except one man. At the defendant's table, Brandon Steele, billionaire, CEO of Steele Capital, stayed seated. Legs casually crossed silver cufflinks, gleaming, one eyebrow raised. He glanced around the room with a smirk, tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I only stand for people who matter," he muttered just loud enough for the courtroom mics to catch. Gasps whispered through the gallery like wind across dry grass. Across the aisle, a man in a worn olive-green jacket slowly stood, hands calmly folded in front of him. His boots scuffed, but solid thudded softly on the floor. His posture was straight military, his face weathered, but striking held a quiet dignity that made him seem carved from something older than time. Long hair tucked behind his ears. No flash, no fury, just presence. His name was Daniel Brooks, single father, former JAG Corps officer, combat tested, decorated, and now by quiet choice an unpaid legal advocate for veterans too broken or too poor to fight for themselves. He stood alone, not for attention, not for protest, just because it was right. And then he spoke, just 5 words low, but unmistakably clear, the kind of voice that carried because it didn't try to. Real worth doesn't need money. Silence. Even the stenographer paused, unsure if it was part of the record. The judge, Honor Sophie Dalton, intelligent, composed, took her seat, her expression unreadable, but something in her eyes flickered. Not just surprise, recognition, respect. Brandon Steele leaned back in his chair and laughed, a sharp, theatrical sound that seemed to bounce off the oak-paneled walls like coins thrown on marble. "Who even are you?" he sneered across the aisle, eyes locked on Daniel. Some washed-up grunt who thinks wearing a green jacket gives him authority in here. Daniel didn't flinch, didn't blink. He simply met the billionaire's gaze with the calm of a man who had seen worse in war zones than any courtroom could ever throw at him. He turned slightly toward the judge, respectfully bowing his head. "Your Honor," he said, voice still low, "I represent the plaintiff class, over 200 veterans defrauded by Steele Capital's fake foundation." He placed a file down on the table, thin but organized like a soldier's field notes. Color-coded tabs, typed, not handwritten. Nothing flashy, just facts. Judge Dalton raised an eyebrow. "You're not on the bar list," she said. Daniel nodded. "I've filed a pro-hack vice request. It's pending approval from the court." He held up the relevant document. "All procedural steps are in order." The judge flipped through the papers briefly, then looked at him again. "And you are?" "Daniel Brooks," he replied. "Former Judge Advocate General, United States Army." The room shifted. Even some of Brandon Steele's attorneys turned their heads, suddenly aware this wasn't just some impassioned spectator. Brandon scoffed and leaned over to whisper something to his high-powered attorney, Derek Callahan, famously aggressive, famously expensive. "This is going to be fun," Brandon muttered. The judge's gavel struck once. "Let's begin." As the first witness was called and the opening motions began, Daniel sat back down, not in arrogance, not in protest, but in readiness. He wasn't here to prove anything, He was here to reveal everything. As the trial proceeded into its first hour, Daniel barely spoke. He listened, watched, took notes with mechanical precision. Brandon, on the other hand, lounged like he owned the room. He chuckled when the prosecution fumbled a document. He smirked when veterans were referred to as unqualified plaintiffs. His entire posture screamed, "I'm untouchable." And yet across from him sat a man who had nothing to gain, no salary, no spotlight, no title, and yet held more moral gravity than anyone in the room. In a quiet corner of the courtroom, Daniel's 11-year-old son, Sam, watched his father from the gallery. A small notebook on his lap, his backpack beside him, eyes fixed on the proceedings, with a seriousness well beyond his age. His father had asked him to come, not to impress him, but to show him something real. Outside, the courthouse media vans lined the street. The public interest wasn't just in the alleged fraud or the billionaire's antics. It was the face-off, the showman billionaire against the quiet soldier. And while cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, someone had captured Daniel's words on a phone. By noon, the clip had gone viral. Real worth doesn't need money. It trended under hashtags like Hormak Green Jacket Truth and Hormakwa Veteran vs Billionaire. Veterans groups shared it. Journalists wrote about it. Even political commentators weighed in. Who was this man who didn't raise his voice, yet somehow commanded silence? Back inside, Judge Dalton called for recess. As everyone rose, Brandon stayed seated once again. But this time, no one noticed him. All eyes were on Daniel, the man who had stood, spoken 5 words, and somehow changed the tone of the entire trial. The clatter of heels and murmurs echoed through the marble hallway as the courtroom recessed for lunch. But Daniel Brooks didn't leave. He sat alone at the plaintiff's table, his military green jacket folded over the back of his chair, sleeves rolled up just past the forearms. His hands were steady, calloused, and busy flipping through deposition transcripts like a surgeon prepping before an operation. Every paper in his binder had been cross-referenced, indexed, and footnoted by his own hand. It wasn't style he brought into that courtroom. It was substance. In the far corner of the public gallery, his son Sam sat quietly eating the peanut butter sandwich his father had packed in the morning. His little sneakers swung above the floor, and his eyes never left his dad. To Sam, the man at that table wasn't a hero. He was homework helper, breakfast maker, and the one who still read, where the red fern grows aloud before bed. But here, in this courtroom, he was something else. Something people were finally beginning to notice. The night before, in their small apartment in Queens, Daniel had sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by evidence binders, legal pads, and Sam's school books stacked off to the side. Sam had asked, "Are you going to win?" Daniel paused. "I'm not here to win," he said. "I'm here so someone finally listens." That answer had stayed with Sam. It stayed with Daniel, too. Daniel had spent 15 years in uniform. First as a JAG Corps prosecutor, then as a combat legal advisor. His final tour had ended abruptly, not because of enemy fire, but because of a casualty far closer to home. His wife, Beth, had died in an accident involving an autonomous vehicle test, the company behind it. A shell entity funded by Steel Capital. The algorithm had failed, brakes didn't engage, and Beth had been in the crosswalk with a bag of groceries. They'd said it was a malfunction. No charges, no responsibility. Daniel hadn't sued, hadn't shouted. He grieved, and then quietly returned to service until Sam needed him more than the Army did. He left active duty, raised his son, and started offering free legal services for veterans across New York, many of whom had lost everything because of the same man now smirking behind a defense table in federal court. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon session began. Daniel said little, but what he said mattered. He questioned one of the veteran plaintiffs, an amputee named Glenn Bates, with gentle clarity. "No, sir," Glenn testified. "They said the foundation would pay for my rehab. Turned out it was a front. Never saw a dime." "Who told you that?" Daniel asked. "Someone from Steel Capital." "Got the emails. Do you recall their name?" "Yeah. Travis C. said he worked in charity compliance. Guess that was a joke." A few people chuckled. Even Judge Dalton's lips twitched. Daniel offered a small nod and said softly, "Thank you for your service, Sergeant." Glenn's eyes misted. "And thank you for fighting for us, sir." A moment passed. Then Brandon Steele leaned forward and whispered something sarcastic to his attorney. Daniel didn't react. He never did. Because silence wasn't weakness to him. It was power, waiting patiently. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy had intensified. The morning's viral clip of Daniel standing in quiet defiance had drawn attention from national outlets. Cable news anchors debated whether this green jacket veteran was the moral compass the country had forgotten. Social media called him the courtroom whisperer. But Daniel never checked his phone. He spent the evening after court, like always, heating up canned soup, helping Sam with math homework, and reviewing affidavits while his son slept. He worked until 1 a.m., cross-checking bank records, sifting through the forensic audit data that should have been handled by a major legal team. But Daniel had no paralegal, no office, no funding. Just his mind, his mission, and a battered leather chair in a one-bedroom apartment. At the next day's hearing, the courtroom was full veterans and uniformed law students, even a few journalists who had expected a circus, but instead found a quiet revolution unfolding in real time. As Daniel prepared to introduce financial evidence, Judge Dalton raised a question. "Mr. Brooks," she said, folding her hands, "before we proceed with the submission of Exhibit D, I'd like to ask, where did you obtain your legal training? The court has reviewed your filings, and frankly, they rival any firm I've seen." Daniel looked up, eyes steady. "I studied law in a place where life and justice shared the same battlefield." A few heads turned. Judge Dalton blinked, then nodded. "Understood. Proceed." It wasn't praise she gave, it was something deeper. Recognition. That evening after court recessed, Daniel took Sam for a walk along the East River. The skyline shimmered gold in the dying light. Dad Sam said, "Why doesn't Mr. Steele get scared?" Daniel considered the question. Because some people build walls so high they can't see the truth, even when it's right in front of them. "Are you going to knock the wall down?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm just showing people what's behind it." They walked in silence, hand in hand. What no one in court knew, yet not even Judge Dalton, was that Daniel had spent the last 3 months digging deeper than any law firm dared. He'd traced offshore accounts, cross-referenced dummy boards, followed the paper trail not just to Steel Capital, but to the exact Cayman Islands foundation used as a laundering mechanism for veteran outreach funds. Tomorrow he would begin to reveal it. But tonight he would tuck in his son, turn off the courtroom in his mind, and remind himself that justice wasn't about noise. It was about persistence. And when the world mocked you for being quiet, that's usually when you're closest to being heard. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 4B. Dust motes drifted in golden rays across the polished walnut benches. The mood in the room had changed. It wasn't obvious not to someone unfamiliar with courtrooms, but to those who'd sat through hundreds of hearings, it was unmistakable. The air carried weight, a new tension, not hostile, but focused, like the room had begun to listen. At the center of it all was the same quiet figure, Daniel Brooks. No tailored suit, no expensive briefcase, just the worn military jacket neatly pressed, a calm face, a soldier's stillness. He was early as always seated at the plaintiff's table reviewing the morning's motions, while the others shuffled in. But today, Judge Sophie Dalton was watching him. From behind the elevated bench, she studied him without expression. For a federal judge, neutrality was sacred. But in the privacy of her thoughts, something stirred. Daniel Brooks had unsettled her, not by what he said, but by what he didn't say. No theatrics, no grandstanding, just precision, calm, and clarity, the kind she hadn't seen in years. She remembered his answer from the previous day I studied law, in a place where life and justice shared the same battlefield. Most people spoke in metaphors when they wanted to impress the court, but that hadn't been metaphor. That had been memory. And it made her wonder who exactly this man was. Sophie Dalton had been appointed to the federal bench at 34, one of the youngest in New York's Southern District, a Harvard Law graduate, former prosecutor, and a known moderate. She was respected for her clarity of reasoning and unflinching fairness. Some called her cold. She preferred precise. She'd presided over cartel cases, cyber fraud, corporate racketeering. But this one was different. Not because of the defendant, Brandon Steele, arrogant billionaire financial predator, charming devil in a Tom Ford suit. She'd seen his type before. No, what made this case unusual was him, the man in the green jacket. The hearing began promptly at 9:00 a.m. Calling case 412F United States versus Brandon Steele, continuation of evidentiary phase, the clerk announced. Daniel rose, as did the battery of lawyers across the aisle. Derek Callahan, Steele's head attorney, gave a polite nod toward the judge, then turned to Daniel with a smirk. "Mr. Brooks," he said in a rehearsed voice. Always a pleasure to see military fashion making a comeback. Daniel offered only a slight smile. Better old fabric than old ethics. A few people in the gallery chuckled. Even the court reporter stifled a grin. Judge Dalton gavelled once, not hard, just enough. "Gentlemen, let's remember this is a court of law." The banter ended. But Sophie noted how Daniel had handled it. No anger, no sarcasm. Just balance, like a man trained to diffuse explosives with words. That day's witness was a forensic accountant from the Department of Justice, confirming irregularities in the Veterans Foundation ledgers. As the witness went through the numbers, Callahan objected repeatedly, trying to slow things down. But Daniel countered each time, citing the federal rules of evidence with effortless clarity. "Objection. Foundation," Callahan snapped. "Your Honor, the documents were certified under Rule 90211, self-authenticating business records. Pre-marked and disclosed under Rule 2603, Daniel replied, not looking up. Judge Dalton blinked. Impressive. Objection overruled. She ruled. Callahan sat down with a little too much force. Sophie watched Daniel closely. His posture never shifted. He wasn't just quoting rules, he knew them as if they were part of his DNA. She made a note in her margin, Brooks' exceptional procedural knowledge, military legal training shows. And then she did something rare. She asked a question. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "the court understands your legal background is in military justice. May I ask what area of law did you practice during active duty?" Daniel looked up, polite, composed. "I served as senior JAG officer in Afghanistan, focused on rules of engagement, violations, war crimes, documentation, and tribunal defense work. And post-service, I've offered pro bono legal support to veterans for the last 7 years, focused on wrongful discharge, housing denial, and benefits fraud." The courtroom fell silent. Even Callahan looked rattled. Sophie didn't respond right away. She stared at the man standing before her. His jacket faded, but his presence sharp as a scalpel. There was no pretense in him. No need to impress. Just facts. Like a field medic with legal tools. "I see," she said at last. "Thank you. Please continue." At recess, Sophie stayed behind on the bench. She opened Daniel's motion filings, not to critique, but to understand. They were meticulous. Not just well-written, but insightful. He'd cross-referenced regulatory code with case law in ways even seasoned clerks would admire. Footnotes were clear, citations exact. But more than that, they had heart. You could feel the human weight behind every page. There was no ego in his work, only purpose. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled. She'd met hundreds of attorneys, some brilliant, some ruthless, most predictable. But this man. She wrote one word in her notes: rare. Later that evening, Sophie stood alone in her chambers, staring out the window toward the city skyline. Lights glittered. Traffic pulsed below like blood in a city's veins. She thought of Daniel's son, Sam, the boy who sat quietly every day in the back row, watching his father, like he was learning something sacred. She wondered what that must be like, to grow up with a man who didn't raise his voice, didn't chase glory, but whose silence spoke louder than courtroom monologues. She remembered something from law school, a quote pinned above her desk. Justice is not thunder. It is steady, relentless rain. And now, she was watching it fall one drop at a time in the form of Daniel Brooks. Meanwhile, Daniel walked Sam home through the crisp evening air. Sam kicked a loose pebble along the sidewalk. "Did the judge like you today?" Sam asked. Daniel chuckled. "That's not really the goal, kiddo." Sam looked up. "But did she?" Daniel paused. "I think she respected the fight." Sam nodded like he understood, and in his way he did. Because some battles aren't won with noise. They're won with truth quietly delivered. And somewhere in a courtroom, someone had started to listen. The courtroom was packed again, press in the back row, veterans in uniform lining the benches, a quiet energy rising like the tide. New York's federal courthouse had become more than a legal arena. It had become a stage. And this morning, the show was about to begin. Brandon Steele arrived late as usual. His Italian loafers clicked arrogantly down the aisle. Flanked by his legal team in sleek charcoal suits, he adjusted his cuffs as if he were stepping onto a red carpet. The man seemed immune to gravity, walking like the floor should thank him for the privilege. "Morning, Your Honor," he said with a grin, nodding toward Judge Dalton, as if they were equals at a charity gala. She didn't smile. "You're 5 minutes late, Mr. Steele," Brandon shrugged. "Some of us still have businesses to run." Daniel Brooks didn't react. He sat calmly at the plaintiff's table reviewing the day's notes. His military green jacket draped over the back of his chair, same as always. He didn't even glance up as the billionaire brushed past. That only irritated Brandon more. The hearing opened with procedural housekeeping confirmation of expert witnesses, admission of additional forensic accounting reports, but the tension hung heavy, waiting to break. It did. When Brandon leaned sideways across the defense table and spoke just loud enough for the room to hear. "So what's your angle, soldier?" he sneered. "You used to shoot rifles. Now you're shooting subpoenas." Daniel looked at him not with anger, but with something more unsettling. Pity. "I never took aim without knowing the cost," he said evenly. "Same applies here." Brandon let out a barking laugh, the kind that demands attention. "You really think you can win this with your hero complex? You're not some legal crusader. You're just a sad vet in a thrift store jacket playing courtroom cowboy." Derek Callahan. Brandon's attorney cleared his throat. "Mr. Steele, I must advise." Brandon waved him off. "Let me talk to the patriot here." He turned fully toward Daniel, now voice rising just enough for the microphones. "You think because you lost your wife, the whole world owes you? That you get to play martyr in front of a judge who feels sorry for you? You think pain makes you righteous?" Daniel's gaze never wavered. "It doesn't," he said softly. "But it makes you honest." And just like that, the temperature shifted. Even the jury pool, carefully selected and told to remain impartial, couldn't help but glance between the two men. The billionaire polished and condescending, the veteran quiet and composed. One man wanted to be heard. The other didn't need to be. Judge Dalton's gavel struck once. Enough. Both parties will maintain courtroom decorum or face sanctions. Brandon sat back, smirking. Of course, Your Honor. Wouldn't want to upset your favorite war hero. A flicker of something crossed her face and was gone. The rest of the morning belonged to the numbers. Daniel presented a series of wire transfers funds allegedly raised by Steel Capital's Veterans Foundation that ended up in overseas shell accounts. He walked the court through the trail like a seasoned guide, each step grounded in documentation. Every number backed by certified banking records. Derek Callahan tried to object multiple times. Speculative. Assumes facts, not in evidence, beyond the scope. But each time Daniel responded with a rule, a citation, or an authenticated document. And each time Judge Dalton replied, objection overruled. Proceed. During a recess, Daniel stood at the hallway water fountain. He drank slowly, wiping his mouth with the sleeve of his shirt. A journalist approached him cautiously. Mr. Brooks. Sir, do you have any comment on Mr. Steele's remarks? Daniel looked at her, thoughtful. He's not on trial for what he says. Then what is he on trial for? Daniel's voice dropped. For forgetting that integrity isn't a performance. Back inside the courtroom buzzed with whispers as the next witness took the stand, a former Steel Capital employee named Maria Givens. She looked nervous, clutching a folder like it might disappear. Daniel nodded gently toward her, as if to say, take your time. You're not alone. Maria opened the folder with trembling hands. These are internal memos. Instructions to reclassify veteran donations as consulting fees, signed by upper management. And who authorized those reclassifications? Daniel asked. A long pause. Then Brandon Steele. I have his initials on 3 directives. Derek Callahan jumped up. Objection? Let her finish. Judge Dalton cut in, eyes narrowed. Maria looked at Daniel. You believed me when no one else would. He offered a small nod. The truth doesn't need applause, just space. That afternoon, the viral clips continued. News anchors replayed the moment Brandon mocked Daniel. But what caught the public's attention wasn't the insult, it was the response. It doesn't. But it makes you honest. That line flooded veteran forums, Facebook groups, and morning talk shows. Some called Daniel the Green Jacket advocate. Others said he reminded them of Atticus Finch if Atticus had served in Iraq and filed court briefs by flashlight in a rented apartment. Brandon didn't notice the shift. He saw the cameras, but not the current. He heard his own voice, but not the silence that followed Daniel's. That night on a rooftop bar in Manhattan, Brandon laughed with hedge fund friends. They're calling him a hero, he scoffed. He's a nobody. Just a sad man in an old coat. But across the city, in a 1-bedroom apartment lit by a desk lamp, Daniel helped Sam with his science homework. When Sam finished, he looked up. Are you mad at that man who yelled at you? Daniel thought for a moment, then smiled. No, but I feel sorry for him. Why? Because he thinks the loudest person wins. Sam blinked. Isn't that true? Daniel placed a hand gently on his son's head. No, kiddo. The ones who stay standing at the end are usually the ones who listened first. The morning air outside the courthouse bit through coats and scarves. A gray sky loomed low over Manhattan, mirroring the tension that hung over the federal courthouse, like a storm cloud ready to split. Inside courtroom 4B, the benches filled early. Veterans, many in worn caps embroidered with their unit names, sat shoulder to shoulder. Law students clutched notepads. Journalists refreshed live blogs, waiting for the next twist in what had become the most watched federal case in the state. And at the center of it, all the quiet man in the faded green jacket. Daniel Brooks had arrived before dawn. He didn't come to make headlines. He came to deliver truth. As the judge took her seat and the court was called into session, the door at the back of the room opened. A woman stepped in, flanked by 2 federal marshals. Petite, early 40s, olive skin, tightly wound hair eyes scanning everything. Her name was Selena Duarte, a former senior accountant at Steel Capital. The room went still. This wasn't just another witness. This was the whistleblower. Judge Sophie Dalton adjusted her glasses. Counsel, the court has reviewed the supplemental filing from the prosecution. Are you prepared to proceed with this witness? Daniel stood. Yes, Your Honor. The defense was notified within the required time frame under Rule 26, and the chain of custody on the submitted documents has been verified. Derek Callahan, Brandon Steele's attorney, stood reluctantly. Your Honor, we object to the inclusion of last-minute evidence. You received it 2 days ago, Sophie said coolly. The court finds no grounds for exclusion. Proceed. Callahan sat down hard, throwing Brandon a tense glance. The billionaire's jaw tightened. Selena was sworn in, her voice quiet, but steady, as she answered the first few procedural questions. Miss Duarte, Daniel said, approaching the witness stand, with measured calm. What was your role at Steel Capital? I managed quarterly reconciliations for 3 of the charitable arms under the VF umbrella, including Veterans Foundation. Were you aware that these foundations were not actually distributing funds to veterans? Selena swallowed hard. Yes. I began noticing inconsistencies 3 years ago. Money marked for housing assistance was being rerouted to holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. And who authorized those transfers? She looked down, then up again. Brandon Steele. I have the internal emails. Daniel nodded, letting the moment settle. Have you provided those emails to the court? I sent them to the Department of Justice, Selena replied. And a copy directly to Mr. Brooks under protected whistleblower status. She held up a flash drive in a sealed evidence pouch. Judge Dalton gestured to the clerk. Please enter the drive into evidence and display Exhibit 14 on the screen. The courtroom lights dimmed. A projector flickered on. An email thread appeared dated August 18, 2022. Subject: reallocation of VF disbursements from Brandon Steele to Selena Duarte. CC Travis Coleman, Chief Financial Officer, move 4M to VF Cayman. Label it International Vet Outreach. No paper trail back to DC. Clear it through old Pipeline 3A. Don't worry, nobody looks at dead soldiers. A ripple of horror moved through the courtroom. Even seasoned court reporters paused their typing. Derek Callahan shot up. Objection. This is prejudicial. Daniel didn't flinch. Your Honor, under Federal Rule 403, the probative value of this document substantially outweighs any prejudicial effect. It's direct evidence of intent. Judge Dalton didn't blink. Objection overruled. She turned to Selena. Ms. Duarte, are you willing to testify under oath that this communication was sent by the defendant? Yes, Your Honor. And the drive was authenticated through DOJ forensic analysis? Yes. Judge Dalton leaned back slowly, her voice even. Let the record show Exhibit 14 is admitted. Brandon's face went pale. He turned to his counsel, whispering something sharp. Callahan didn't reply. His fingers clenched the armrest. Daniel returned to his table, calm as ever. He didn't gloat, didn't look victorious. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about unveiling. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed like bees to honey. By lunchtime, the email was everywhere. CNN, Fox, MSNBC. Even tabloids picked it up. Memes appeared online with Brandon's face next to the words, "Don't worry, nobody looks at dead soldiers." Veteran groups across the country released statements. Some protested outside Steel Capital offices. Others raised flags at half-staff in quiet fury. A line had been crossed, and Daniel had made sure everyone saw it. That evening, Judge Dalton sat in her chambers long after court adjourned. She reread the emails. The wording wasn't just careless, it was cruel. the kind of callousness that corrupted the soul of institutions. She closed her laptop and stared at the dark skyline beyond the window. And for the first time in years, she felt a chill that wasn't from the weather. She reached for her notepad and wrote in the margin, "This isn't just fraud, it's moral decay." Then, reluctantly, she let her thoughts drift to Daniel. She remembered his restraint, his unwillingness to celebrate even after delivering a fatal blow to the defense. He carried his pain like a soldier, carried a wounded comrade, not as burden, but as duty. She wondered if he even knew what he looked like from the outside, a man alone but not lost, steady like a lighthouse in a storm no one else could navigate. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, Sam stared at the news on the small television. "Dad," he whispered. He really said that about soldiers. Daniel gently turned off the screen. "Some people forget what sacrifice means, son." "Will he go to jail now?" Daniel exhaled. "That's not for me to decide. That's why we have courts, judges, process." Sam looked confused. "But you brought the truth." Daniel smiled faintly. "Truth doesn't walk people to prison. It just opens the door." And now the door was wide open. The trial had changed. The tide had turned. And the billionaire who once laughed at the green-jacketed veteran now found himself drowning not in noise, but in silence. The silence of a courtroom that had finally fully begun to listen. The courthouse was unusually still that morning. It wasn't silence, not really. There were the usual echoes of heels, soft murmurs from the press benches, the hum of overhead lights. But underneath it all was a heavy, deliberate quiet. Everyone sensed it. The case had crossed a line. The moment Selena Duarte's whistleblower email had been admitted into evidence, the moment the world saw those words. "Don't worry, nobody looks at dead soldiers." Everything had shifted. Now the trial wasn't just about numbers. It was about something darker, something moral. Brandon Steele arrived to find protesters outside the courthouse, veterans, families of fallen soldiers. Some held signs, others held nothing at all, just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, heads high, silent. He scoffed as his town car pulled into the garage. This is all theater. Inside his legal team was grim. Even Derek Callahan, usually smug, had gone quiet. The defense's firewall, one built with charisma, corporate confidence, and procedural delays, had cracked. And now Brandon was doing what all powerful men do when threatened. He lashed out. As the courtroom filled, Judge Sophie Dalton entered briskly, her expression unreadable. "Good morning," she said, adjusting her robe. "We will continue with pre-cross arguments. The court has reviewed the motion for recusal filed by the defense. Mr. Callahan, please proceed." Callahan stood. "Your Honor, we respectfully submit that ongoing judicial bias may compromise the fairness of this trial. The public nature of the case, combined with inflammatory reactions from veteran communities," Sophie raised a hand. "You're implying I'm compromised because I've ruled in favor of admissible evidence." "No, Your Honor. We're implying that the public perception of alignment Daniel Brooks stood." "Permission to respond, Your Honor granted." He stepped forward slowly, deliberately. Calm voice. "No theatrics. This is not a question of perception. It's a question of truth. Your Honor's rulings have followed the rules of procedure. If the defense is rattled, it's not because the court is biased. It's because the truth is loud even when spoken softly." A few heads turned. Sophie met Daniel's eyes for a fraction longer than necessary. Then she looked back at the defense. "Motion to recuse is denied. This court remains impartial." "We proceed." Callahan sat. Brandon muttered something beneath his breath, something profane. Sophie turned sharply. "Mr. Steele, if you speak out of turn again, I'll hold you in contempt." He smirked. "Of course. Wouldn't want to upset your soldier boy." A hush fell over the courtroom. Even Callahan flinched. But Sophie didn't rise, didn't yell. She leaned forward, voice steady as steel. "This is a federal courtroom, Mr. Steele, not one of your boardrooms. You will conduct yourself with the respect the law demands. One more outburst, and I'll have you removed." Then she paused, just long enough for her next words to strike deep. "And for the record, the law doesn't care who you are. It only cares what you've done." In the next hour, Daniel submitted a supplemental affidavit from a retired systems administrator who had validated the timestamps on the VF Cayman transactions. The documentation was ironclad, every movement of money traced, every shell corporation named, each numbered account linked back to a personal authorization by Brandon Steele. And when Judge Dalton reviewed it, she didn't blink. Her gavel dropped once firm. This court recognizes that the evidence presented meets the burden of probable fraud and supports the plaintiff's class action. We will proceed toward evidentiary review for obstruction and potential criminal referral, Brandon snapped. He stood fists clenched and slammed his palms on the table. "This is a joke. You're all frauds. That man he pointed at Daniel isn't a lawyer. He's a washed-up vet with a dead wife and a bleeding heart." Dead silence. Sam Brooks, sitting in the gallery, flinched. Daniel didn't move. Not at first. Then he rose slowly, the way someone rises at a funeral or in memory of a fallen friend. He turned not to the court, not to the cameras, but directly to Brandon. And he said, voice even but firm, "You took money meant for veterans and buried it offshore. You funded your vacations with their pain. And now, when confronted with truth, you spit on it like it's beneath you." A pause. "Then my wife died because of your greed. I chose not to sue, not to scream. I chose to fight for what you'll never understand, dignity, honor. And now you'll answer to all the men and women you pretended to care about." Then he turned to the judge. "I rest for today, Your Honor." Judge Dalton nodded, once her eyes steady. "This court is adjourned until 9:00 a.m. tomorrow." Outside, the press exploded. Every outlet ran the headline. "Billionaire explodes in courtroom meltdown. Singledad. Veteran silences. Steele with honor. Judge Dalton. The law doesn't care who you are." But inside her chambers, Sophie sat alone. She reviewed the transcript, highlighted passages, evaluated the integrity of the chain of evidence, and then, against every instinct she had to remain impartial, she opened a sealed file labeled Brooks Daniel. Military record, service commendations, JAG case history. She read it all, slowly, carefully. And when she reached the page listing Beth Brooks' death and the coroner's report citing the failed autonomous vehicle, she set the folder down and closed her eyes. It wasn't bias. It was clarity. Meanwhile, Daniel walked with Sam along the East River. They didn't talk about court. They talked about school. Sam's math test. His friend Ben, who was moving to Chicago. Then after a while, Sam looked up. "Dad, did you win today?" Daniel paused. "No. But the truth did. Tomorrow, the court would hear from another witness. But today, something had shifted. Not just the case, the country. People were watching. And for the first time in a long time, they weren't watching for spectacle. They were watching for justice. The rain came in light, steady sheets, not the kind that screamed for attention, but the kind that settled into concrete, soaked into coats, and quieted even the noisiest corners of New York City. Inside courtroom 4B, the tension was just as steady. Not loud, but mounting. The media had already dubbed it the quiet trial that roared. Veterans gathered outside in quiet solidarity. Across the country, people who had never cared about courtrooms now watched every update with the reverence of a national reckoning. And at the center of it still calm, still silent, still unshakably present, was Daniel Brooks. Court resumed at exactly 9:00 a.m. Judge Sophie Dalton entered without fanfare, her robe trailing like the hem of a shadow. Her face was as composed as ever, but there was something different in her posture, a new sharpness. The kind of posture that only appears when a judge knows the endgame has begun. "Mr. Brooks," she said, eyes down at the docket, "you may proceed." Daniel rose slowly. No rush, no dramatic flourish, just the sound of his chair sliding back, a quiet acknowledgement of purpose. "Your Honor," he said, "the plaintiffs moved to submit Exhibit 18, an internal email exchange between Brandon Steele and Travis Coleman, his former CFO, dated March 12th of last year. This exhibit is accompanied by a sworn affidavit from Steele Capital's IT director, confirming its authenticity and secure retrieval under chain of custody." He handed a sealed packet to the clerk. Sophie nodded. "Display Exhibit 18. The screen flickered to life. Text appeared. Subject: VF Cayman routing finalization. From Brandon Steele to Travis Coleman. Date: March 12, 2023 to 7 a.m. Transfer the remaining $4 million to VF Cayman through Pipeline 7. Label it Veterans Reintegration Benefit in case we're audited. Once it lands, move $2.0 million to Blackthorn Consulting usual shell. Tell PR to draft a press release about PTSD programs. Keep Brooks quiet if he starts poking. Hire someone to dig into his wife's accident. Use it if we have to." A silence heavier than any gavel blow filled the courtroom. Then a collective inhale. Then stillness again. Even Callahan didn't move. Even Brandon's breathing seemed to pause. Judge Dalton's eyes were locked on the screen. The line that hung in the air wasn't about money, not even about the shell companies. It was, keep Brooks quiet if he starts poking. Hire someone to dig into his wife's accident. Use it if we have to. Sophie's voice was colder than the rain outside. "Mr. Brooks," she said barely above a whisper, "has this email been authenticated?" "Yes, Your Honor." It was stored on Steele Capital's redundant servers, encrypted but accessible through a backup node after a failed software migration. The IT director provided full forensic logs, including internal IPs and metadata timestamps. The DOJ confirmed chain integrity, and this was submitted with an affidavit. "Yes," she turned to the clerk. "Enter Exhibit 18 into the record. This court will take a recess in 1 hour to review the contents independently." But it was too late for recesses now. The court and the country had seen enough. Daniel turned toward the defense table. Brandon wasn't smirking anymore. His face was taut. Hollow. The kind of hollow that money couldn't fill. "You went after my family," Daniel said softly. "You didn't just steal from the people I swore to protect. You tried to weaponize my grief." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You could have chosen integrity. You chose manipulation. You could have honored sacrifice. You chose profit. You used a foundation meant for heroes to line your pockets." He stepped closer. Just a step. The entire room seemed to lean with him. "You mocked me in front of the world, Mr. Steele. But today, it's the truth that's laughing." Callahan stood up, but it was a reflex, not strategy. "Your Honor, the defense moves to strike the emotional testimony denied," Sophie snapped. "This is no longer just civil fraud. The evidence presented implicates potential obstruction of justice, witness, intimidation, and conspiracy to defraud under federal statute." She turned to the clerk. "Schedule an emergency hearing with the U.S. Attorney's Office for immediate review of criminal referral. I will authorize a temporary freeze of all Steele Capital assets pending that meeting." Brandon jolted up. "You can't do that." Sophie met his eyes with granite stillness. "I just did." He lunged forward. "You have no idea who I am. I've met presidents. I've donated to half the Senate." She didn't flinch, "and now you'll meet a jury. 2 U.S. Marshals moved to his side. Brandon looked around, desperate, wild. To Callahan, to the press, to the jury box, and then finally to Daniel. "You think this is over? You think the court cares about some dead wife and a charity scam?" Daniel didn't answer. He turned back toward his table, calmly gathering his documents. But from the back of the room, a voice rang out, thin, young, but clear. It was Sam. Daniel's son had stood. "She wasn't just someone's wife," he said. "She was my mom." The entire courtroom froze. Brandon sat back down slowly, like something had finally broken. Later that evening, as the courthouse emptied, and stormed rains swallowed the day's rain, Judge Dalton stood alone in her chambers. She stared out the window, watching the streetlights flicker through fogged glass. Her hand rested gently on the file marked Brooks versus Steele. And in her journal, a place where she rarely wrote anymore, she scribbled, "Justice doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it enters in silence, wearing a green jacket." Meanwhile, in a quiet apartment in Queens, Daniel sat beside Sam as the boy drifted to sleep. He stared at the ceiling. There was no victory dance, no champagne, just the knowledge that he'd stood up, not just against a man like Steele, but against the machinery that let men like him thrive. And tomorrow would be about what came next. The news broke before sunrise. Every national outlet ran the headline, "Federal Judge Orders Emergency Asset Freeze of Steele Capital Criminal Charges Pending." Cable shows opened with footage of Brandon Steele, stone-faced, leaving the courtroom under U.S. Marshal escort. Overnight, public opinion flipped like a switch. The once untouchable billionaire was now a man under siege. But while the courtroom had gone quiet, the world beyond it had grown loud. Too loud. Daniel Brooks didn't check the news that morning. Instead, he packed Sam's lunch turkey sandwich apple slices, 2 oatmeal cookies wrapped in wax paper, and walked him to the bus stop. The boy's backpack bounced as he climbed aboard, but his eyes lingered on his dad. "Will they be mad at you now?" Sam asked softly. Daniel crouched down, steady as always. "Some people will." "Yeah," he said. "The ones who are afraid of the truth usually shout the loudest." Sam frowned. "So, you're in trouble?" Daniel smiled. "No, son. I'm in purpose." The doors hissed shut. The bus drove off, and Daniel turned to walk back into a different kind of battlefield. By 10 a.m., the backlash had begun. Brandon Steele's PR machine, long dormant, arrogant in its silence, had roared to life overnight. Every network had a talking head. "Daniel Brooks is politicizing pain," said one anchor. "He's using his wife's death to manipulate the court," said another. A viral blog post accused him of fabricating his military record. A syndicated op-ed called him the man weaponizing tragedy. By noon, bots flooded veteran forums with doubt. And by 1:00 p.m., Daniel's name trended not as a hero, but as a target. Brooks Lizana under a stolen valor orchestrator. Sympathy litigation. It was digital warfare, and Daniel, he didn't even own a Twitter account. Inside courtroom 4B, Judge Sophie Dalton was reviewing briefs when her clerk entered with a sealed envelope. "It's from the Department of Justice," she said quietly, "regarding digital interference in the Steele case." Sophie opened it, scanned the contents, and set it down. Her eyes narrowed. Outside influence, coordinated smear tactics, bot amplification traced to private contractors with ties to Blackthorn Consulting, the same shell company Brandon used to reroute stolen veteran funds. It wasn't just a PR counterattack, it was strategic defamation. And it was dangerous. Downstairs, Daniel entered the courthouse alone. He could feel the shift in the air, not fear, but friction. Reporters who had once nodded at him now held their mics tighter. Security lingered longer at the door. Someone snapped a photo just a little too close. He kept walking. No words, no reaction. because the louder they got, the quieter he became. The session opened with procedural motions. The defense filed a request for a temporary media gag order, citing unfair public narrative. Judge Dalton denied it. You built your empire in the spotlight, Mr. Steele. The truth will stand there with you. But as Daniel prepared his notes, a slip of paper arrived at the plaintiff's table. It was anonymous. Slid to the clerk, handed off without comment. 3 lines typed. Back off. Your son is not untouchable. We know his bus route. Daniel froze. For a fraction of a second, just one, his breath hitched. Then, like steel cooling under pressure, he folded the note and placed it in his breast pocket. Sophie saw the change in his eyes. She couldn't read the note, but she could feel the gravity shift. Mr. Brooks, she said quietly. Do you wish to request a private recess? Daniel looked at her. No fear, but something more, primal, protective instinct. No, Your Honor. We proceed. She nodded once slowly, but inside her judicial instincts screamed. She made a silent decision. After this session, she would personally contact U.S. Marshals for a full security review. No more procedural distance. This had just gotten personal. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of witness logistics and expert financial testimony. But the crowd had thinned not in number, but in trust. Doubt was in the air. Until the very end of the session, when Daniel stood not to present evidence, but to address the silence. I've been accused of a lot these past 24 hours, he said calmly. I won't answer the noise. I don't need to. He held up a copy of the Veterans Foundation's original grant agreement pages, yellowed signed by hand, promising scholarships, rehab funding, housing support, none of which had ever been delivered. This is what matters, he said. This document, and the men and women it betrayed. He paused. Let the world argue about my past. I'm here for their future. The courtroom stood still. Judge Dalton lowered her pen. She looked at Daniel as if seeing something not in the legal brief, but in the character of a man. Then she turned to the court. This trial is not about one man's pain. It is about a pattern of fraud that undermines the dignity of every veteran who wore this country's uniform. The court will not be intimidated by external noise or internal manipulation. Her gavel struck like thunder. Adjourned. Outside cameras waited, but Daniel didn't stop. He exited through the side gate, disappeared into the crowd, made one phone call to the school to confirm that Sam was already home safe. He didn't go on the news that night. He didn't defend his name. He made dinner. Then later, he sat beside his son, and together they reread Where the Red Fern Grows, a book about loss, about loyalty, about quiet strength. And when Sam asked, "Are we okay, Dad?" Daniel smiled. Truth always walks through fire, he said, but it never walks alone. A cold, pale sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows as the courtroom filled once again. But something had changed, something deep. This wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It had become a reckoning. Federal investigators now monitored from the back row. Marshals flanked the defense table. Dozens of veterans stood outside in silent formation, arms crossed, eyes locked on the courthouse doors. They didn't carry signs. They carried memory. They carried loss. And today, they were here for justice. Judge Sophie Dalton took the bench at precisely 9 a.m. Her robe moved like a flag, caught in a sharp wind. Her eyes swept the courtroom steady-focused. Today, she announced, we proceed to closing evidentiary summaries before final arguments. The court recognizes Daniel Brooks as lead counsel for the plaintiff class. She didn't have to say anything more. Everyone was waiting for him. Daniel stood. Alone. No firm behind him. No PR team. No legal entourage. Just a folder in his hand, weathered at the edges, and a truth that had refused to die. He stepped to the center of the courtroom, paused, and looked at the jury. Older veterans, a retired teacher, a small business owner, a nurse, all of them watching him with quiet intensity. Then he began. I've been called many things over the past few weeks. A grieving widower, a veteran looking for vengeance, a man who wears an old jacket like it still means something. Maybe all of that's true. But I'm not here to ask for sympathy. I'm here to ask you to look. Really look. He held up a copy of the Veterans Foundation brochure, bright blue, featuring smiling soldiers and American flags. A marketing masterpiece and a complete lie. This foundation promised housing, rehab, scholarships. What it delivered was silence. Broken promises buried under tax shelters and offshore accounts. Brandon Steele didn't just steal money. He stole hope. He stepped closer to the jury box, his voice firm but never loud. You've heard the numbers. 17.6 million diverted. You've seen the memos. Reallocations labeled as consulting. You read the email, the one that said, "Don't worry, nobody looks at dead soldiers." I'm asking you to prove them wrong, to say with your verdict, "We see them now." A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the court reporter had slowed typing every word with reverent clarity. Daniel nodded. Once, then returned to his seat. Then came Derek Callahan. The defense attorney rose with all the confidence his 800-an-hour reputation could muster. But the room had turned on him, and he knew it. He cleared his throat, glanced at Brandon, who sat visibly sweating behind the table, and began a mechanical rebuttal. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case about accounting interpretation, not malice. About procedure, not betrayal. My client operated within the legal framework. Someone in the gallery coughed loudly. Callahan faltered. The plaintiffs. They present emotion, not evidence. A tragedy doesn't make one a legal authority. And Mr. Brooks, despite his compelling narrative, is not, Judge Dalton interjected. Counsel, you may address the facts, not impugn character. Callahan tried to recover, but the damage had been done. The contrast was undeniable. One man told the truth, like he'd earned it in fire. The other danced around it like it burned to touch. After lunch, Judge Dalton returned with final instructions for the jury. But before dismissing them for deliberation, she paused. And then, breaking federal courtroom tradition, she spoke. As officers of this court, we are bound not just by law, but by principle. This case has revealed not only violations of financial trust, but also of moral trust. The verdict you render is not simply about numbers. It's about what kind of country we claim to be. She dismissed the jury with those words still hanging in the air. The deliberation didn't take long. 2 hours. That was it. The courtroom reassembled, and tension coiled like wire around every corner of the room. Sophie took the bench. Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? An older woman stood. Soft voice. Steady tone. We have your honor. And what say you in the matter of Brooks et al. Versus Steele Capital Inc. on the charge of fraudulent misrepresentation guilty, and on the charge of conspiracy to commit financial abuse of a non-profit entity, guilty, and on the charge of obstruction of justice by intent to defame and intimidate a witness, guilty. The final word echoed. Brandon Steele's face didn't change, not at first. He stared straight ahead like his world hadn't just collapsed around him. Then the bailiffs moved. His wrists were cuffed with a click that sounded louder than thunder. He turned once to Daniel, sneering through clenched teeth. This isn't the end. Daniel stood calmly. No, he said. It's the beginning for them. He gestured toward the back row where veterans sat, some teary-eyed, some nodding, some standing with hands over their hearts. Outside, the crowd erupted. But Daniel didn't go to the podium. He didn't wave to cameras. He found Sam instead, waiting with a quiet pride in his small hands. Sam hugged him tight. You didn't yell, the boy whispered. You never even raised your voice. Daniel smiled. You don't have to shout when truth is finally being heard. That night, Judge Dalton stayed in her chambers long after the courthouse lights dimmed. She stared at the empty courtroom through frosted glass. She thought about the green-jacketed man who never raised his voice, about the boy who stood in court for his mother, about what justice really sounds like, not thunder, but something gentler, something lasting. She whispered softly to herself. The courtroom didn't make him powerful. His silence did. The walls of the holding cell were pristine, clean, clinical fluorescent, but to Brandon Steele, they may as well have been carved from stone. Hours had passed since the verdict. The designer suit he wore that morning now hung stiffly on his shoulders. His cufflinks confiscated his belt. Gone. He sat alone, elbows on knees, eyes dull. For the first time in his life, the cameras had turned away from him. At the courthouse above, Judge Sophie Dalton sat with the U.S. Attorney and the court's chief magistrate. The decision had been made. The evidence submitted by Daniel Brooks, the paper trail, the shell corporations, the intimidation notes, and now a criminal conviction left no room for interpretation. She signed the revocation of bail without hesitation. A few minutes later, 2 U.S. Marshals entered Brandon's cell. On your feet. You're being remanded without bail, pending criminal sentencing. Brandon stood slowly. I'll appeal, he muttered. You're welcome to, one marshal replied. But tonight, you're going to federal lockup. The cuffs clicked again. And just like that, the man who once moved millions with a phone call was walked out like a common felon. In the main courtroom, Daniel Brooks remained seated long after everyone else had cleared out. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't even moving. He sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, his fingers gently resting on the file of the Veterans Foundation victims. Their photos faded, clipped from old IDs, and VA documents lined the pages. One by one, he whispered their names to himself. Then softly, he closed the folder. Justice, he murmured, was never about one man's downfall. It was about their dignity. As Daniel gathered his things, Judge Dalton descended from the bench. Breaking protocol, she crossed the courtroom floor toward him. He looked up, slightly surprised. I thought judges weren't supposed to mingle post-verdict, he said gently. We aren't, Sophie replied with a quiet smile. But after what I saw in this courtroom, I'm willing to blur the line just this once. Daniel stood, offering a firm nod. Thank you for protecting the process. You honored it, she said. Every step of the way. There was a pause between them. Not awkward, but heavy, filled with something unspoken yet understood. Then Sophie asked, What happens now? Mr. Brooks, Daniel looked toward the gallery, now empty except for a janitor sweeping the back row. I go home, make dinner, help my son with his math homework. Then tomorrow, I start building something that lasts. She tilted her head. More cases, he smiled faintly. No, a foundation for veterans who want to study law, so they can be the ones in this room one day, speaking the truth with their own voices. Sophie's expression softened. Let me know when it's formed, she said. I have interns to recommend. That evening, the Department of Justice formally announced a multi-count federal indictment against Brandon Steele. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, intimidation of a federal witness, diversion of nonprofit funds, money laundering through international fronts. Bail was denied. All Steele Capital bank accounts were frozen. Trading halted. Brand partnerships fled. Stock value collapsed 38% overnight. By morning, the empire was ash and rumor. And the man once featured on the cover of Forbes now sat in a federal detention center, awaiting sentencing. The country responded. Veteran communities lit up social media not with rage, but with something rarer. Gratitude. Clips of Daniel's courtroom speeches were now taught in law schools. Sam's quote, "She was my mom," was embroidered onto patches sent to Gold Star families. And in Queens, inside a modest apartment, a letter arrived in a plain white envelope. No return address, just a typewritten note inside. "Because of you, my dad's getting his first hearing in 6 years. Thank you for not giving up." A daughter of a forgotten soldier, Daniel sat with the letter for a long time, then folded it and placed it in the same file as Beth's photograph. The next day at the federal courthouse, Brandon Steele was escorted into a smaller courtroom for a sentencing hearing. Daniel didn't attend. He didn't need to. Justice had already landed, and Brandon, once worshipped, feared, envied, now stood in front of a judge who addressed him with none of the deference he had once demanded. Sophie looked down from the bench. "The court finds your actions calculated, deceptive, and corrosive to public trust. You exploited patriotism for personal gain. You mocked integrity, and you targeted those who could not fight back." Brandon said nothing. "I sentence you to 12 years in federal custody," she said. "No parole, full restitution." Her gavel fell, and with it, the last illusion of power Brandon Steele had ever held. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel and Sam sat on a park bench beneath a pale October sky. Sam held a brochure in his hands, a mock-up for the soon-to-be-launched Brooks Justice Foundation. "You're naming it after yourself?" Sam asked. Daniel chuckled. "No, I'm naming it after us." Sam smiled. "Will I get to help?" Daniel nodded. "One day, you'll run it." There was a quiet moment as the wind stirred the trees. Then Sam asked, "Was it worth it?" "Dad." All of this, Daniel looked out across the park, where people walked freely, where kids played, where no one cared about money or media, just peace. "It was never about winning," he said. "It was about making sure the truth didn't get drowned out." He looked down at his son. "And about making sure you grow up in a world where the quiet ones still have a voice." It began with 1 letter, then 10, then 100. Within a week of Brandon Steele's sentencing, Daniel Brooks' mailbox, both physical and digital, overflowed. Not with fanfare, not with praise, but with something far more powerful testimony. Handwritten notes from veterans who had never spoken aloud about the shame of being denied care. Emails from military widows who'd once applied to Steele's fraudulent foundation only to be ghosted and forgotten. One card arrived in a crumpled envelope. It had no return address, no signature, just 4 words written in shaky pen. You made them listen. Daniel read every single one. Late into the night after Sam had gone to sleep, he sat at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee and stacks of folded truths. Some letters had stains from hands that trembled. Others carried military insignia drawn in the corners, crude, heartfelt, unmistakably real. Each one told the same story in different voices. I thought I was invisible. They told me to stop asking. Your voice helped me find mine. And as Daniel read a truth larger than any verdict began to form, not as a roar, but as a rising tide. He had become a signal fire, and people were sailing toward it. Judge Sophie Dalton noticed the ripple too. Inside chambers, her clerk delivered a stack of mail addressed not to the court, but to her, personally, something that rarely happened. Many were from law students, others from citizens. Some were angry. Most weren't. One letter stood out. A single mother from Kansas wrote, "I've never trusted the justice system. But I watched what happened in your courtroom. I watched a man speak not for himself, but for people like my brother who didn't come back right. And I believed in something again." Sophie placed the letter in her drawer. She didn't show it to anyone. But that night, she walked home slower than usual, her fingers grazing the stone railing outside the courthouse, feeling for the first time in years like she wasn't just enforcing the law, She was helping restore faith in it. Meanwhile, cable news moved on. New headlines, new scandals, new distractions. But the truth Daniel Brooks had unleashed didn't need airtime. It moved quieter, deeper. Local bar associations began inviting him to speak, not about the case, but about ethics, veteran representation, quiet leadership. He declined most offers, not out of pride, but because he wasn't finished building. In a modest office above a family-owned hardware store in Queens, Daniel opened the doors to the Brooks Justice Foundation. The logo was simple, a stylized, folded American flag beneath a balanced scale of justice. Its mission, to provide legal education, mentorship, and representation for veterans seeking to serve justice in and out of uniform. The waiting list for applicants filled within 2 weeks. One of the first volunteers was a third-year law student named Eva Martinez, the daughter of a Marine who'd passed from Agent Orange complications. She walked in, shook Daniel's hand firmly, and said, "I don't want to work for power. I want to work for purpose." He hired her on the spot. Back at home, Sam was growing too. The boy who once carried quiet sadness in his backpack now wore a new confidence. He asked more questions, told more jokes, even started a class project on unsung American heroes, for which he wrote about his father and included a hand-drawn picture of the green military jacket that had become legend. One evening, Daniel found the drawing taped to the fridge. Underneath it, in Sam's careful handwriting, he didn't yell. He just stood. Daniel stared at the words for a long time, then quietly, almost reverently, pinned his wife Beth's photo beside it. The ripple continued. A U.S. senator mentioned the Steele trial in a floor speech on nonprofit oversight reform. Veterans Affairs departments across 3 states began audits of their own public-private foundations. Law professors rewrote syllabi to include Brooks v. Steele Capital, Inc. as a modern case study on whistleblower protection and ethical prosecution. And in a town outside San Diego, a veteran named Luis Gutierrez, once denied housing funds by Steele's fake foundation, won his appeal and received full retroactive benefits. His lawyer, a former Navy linguist named Carla Reese, now working pro bono with the Brooks Foundation. But perhaps the most unexpected ripple came one rainy afternoon. Daniel was walking back from the corner store when a woman, maybe mid-60s, elegant but modest, stopped him. "You're the man from the court," she said. Daniel paused. "Yes, ma'am." She didn't give her name, didn't explain how she knew him. She just looked into his eyes and whispered, "I didn't believe men like you existed anymore." And then she walked away. Daniel stood there for a moment, still, solemn. Then tucked the memory in the same quiet place he kept his medals, the ones he never displayed, but never forgot. That night in Judge Dalton's home, she stared at the blank page of her leather-bound journal. After weeks of silence, her pen finally moved. "The law is not a gavel. It is the courage of those who speak when no one else will." She paused, then added one more line. "Some men wear power. Some men carry it. And some simply become it." The cemetery was quiet. Rows of white markers stretched like silent soldiers across the grass, catching the early spring light. Birds sang in the distance, and a soft wind rustled the flags left by visitors. It wasn't mournful. It was peaceful, like the place itself had long accepted its duty to carry memory without weight. Daniel Brooks stood near a familiar headstone, not for ceremony, not for grief, just to keep a promise. His son Sam held a small bouquet of lilies and placed them gently at the base of the marker. No tears today, just quiet reflection. "She would have liked the verdict," Sam said softly. Daniel nodded, kneeling beside his boy. "She would have liked how brave you were." Sam looked down. "I was scared." "I know. But courage isn't about not being scared. It's about speaking anyway." They stayed there for a while, hand in hand, listening to the wind. It had been a month since the trial ended. The media storm had died down. Brandon Steele's name had slipped from the headlines, replaced by new scandals, new chaos. The cameras had moved on. But for Daniel, the real story was just beginning. Later that day at the city's Veterans Memorial Park, a small crowd had gathered. No reporters, no podiums, just veterans' families and law students, standing in front of a folding table with a banner, Brooks Justice Foundation, Community Meet and Mentor. There were no speeches, just conversations. Daniel moved from table to table, answering questions, offering resources, helping fill out applications for legal aid. At one point, an elderly black Marine Vietnam vet leaned over and said, "You're that quiet one from TV, the one who made that billionaire sit down real hard." Daniel smiled. "I just brought the receipts. The court did the rest." The man chuckled. "Naw, son. You didn't just bring the receipts. You brought dignity." He held out a weathered hand. Daniel shook it with both of his. Toward the end of the afternoon, as the sun began to soften, a familiar voice rose behind him. Still not comfortable being called a hero, Daniel turned. Judge Sophie Dalton stood at the edge of the park, her black coat catching the breeze, a canvas tote in one hand, no robe, no bench, no walls between them this time. Daniel smiled. "Depends who's doing the calling." She approached, eyes bright, voice gentler than it had been in court. "I was nearby. Thought I'd stop by. See what this new movement looks like when it's not inside 4 marble walls." He gestured to the park around them. Conversations, nods, quiet resilience. "It looks like healing," he said. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching a young veteran laugh with a child by the water fountain. Sophie finally spoke. "You've changed a lot of lives, Daniel." He looked at her. "I just opened a few doors." "No," she said. "You reminded people what justice feels like. Not shouted. Not punished. Just made visible again." Daniel folded his arms. "Coming from you, that means more than you know." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "I've been thinking about what you said. About helping veterans become lawyers." "We're starting slow," Daniel said. "But yes, real representation. From those who've walked the fire." "I'd like to teach a class," Sophie said suddenly. Daniel looked at her, surprised. She continued, "Not as a judge, as a mentor. I've seen too many courts filled with people who know the law but not the weight behind it." Daniel grinned, a genuine, full expression that stretched across years of grief and rebuilding. "Then welcome aboard, Your Honor," she laughed. "Sophie, just Sophie out here." They shook hands not as judge and plaintiff but as equals, as allies. As the crowd thinned and dusk crept across the sky, Daniel offered to walk her back to the edge of the park. They strolled in silence for a time, the kind of silence that needs no explanation. Then she stopped. "There's something else," Sophie said. "Something I didn't get to say after the verdict." Daniel turned to her. "You reminded me why I went into law. I'd forgotten. Not all at once, just little pieces chipped away by calendars and politics and pressure. But watching you in court, watching the way you carried truth like it was a living thing, it brought me back." Daniel's voice was soft. "I didn't do that alone." "No," she said. "But you were the spark." He looked at her. Then not as the judge who'd overseen the trial of a billionaire, but as a woman who had stood firm when it counted. And in her eyes, he saw something unexpected, something healing, something hopeful. They reached the gate. "I should go," Sophie said. "You could stay," Daniel offered, surprising even himself. She raised an eyebrow. Was that a lawyerly suggestion or a personal one? He chuckled. "I'm not wearing my tie." "So, personal." A pause. Then she nodded. "Maybe next time." And with that, she turned, disappearing into the growing night. Daniel remained by the gate for a long moment. Then he walked back to the folding table where Sam waited with an empty cookie tray. Dad Sam asked, "Do you think all of this really made a difference?" Daniel crouched beside him. "Not all at once," he said. "But like throwing a stone in a pond, the ripple keeps moving even when you can't see it anymore." Sam nodded thoughtfully. Then he asked, "What do we do next?" Daniel smiled. "We keep throwing stones." The morning sun spilled gold across the lawn of Hudson Law School, illuminating banners that read, "Inauguration Ceremony, Brooks Justice Foundation Fellowship Program." Rows of white folding chairs faced a small podium. Some guests wore crisp suits, others wore well-worn uniforms, Army, Navy, Air Force. There were students, judges, veterans, teachers, and quiet men and women with hands weathered by service and sacrifice. At the center of the front row sat Sam Brooks. Now 12, his feet planted firmly, his back straight like his father had taught him. And beside him, wearing the same green military jacket still frayed at the cuffs, still carrying the weight of a lifetime, stood Daniel Brooks. He didn't like speeches. But today wasn't about speaking. Today was about passing the light forward. The dean of the law school introduced the event. She spoke briefly about ethics, about service, and about Daniel's case, now part of legal ethics curricula across the country. Then she turned to the podium. "Please welcome the man whose quiet strength reshaped how we define courage in the courtroom, Mr. Daniel Brooks." Applause rose, not thunderous but respectful, the kind that came from people who knew what it cost someone to do the right thing when no one else would. Daniel approached the microphone. He didn't unfold his notes. He just spoke. "When I first walked into that courtroom, I wasn't trying to make headlines. I didn't come to start a movement. I came because I promised my son and my late wife that I would stand when standing mattered. And somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't the only one. There were thousands of voices waiting to be heard. Veterans, families, people silenced by bureaucracy, by money, by fear. I didn't give them courage. I just reminded them they already had it." He paused, looking out over the crowd. "This foundation isn't built on money. It's built on memory of those who gave their voices and those who never had the chance. If we can equip even one veteran to stand in court, not as a defendant, but as an advocate, then we're not just teaching law. We're teaching justice." He stepped back. No applause this time, just a room full of people rising to their feet, silently, solemnly, as if standing was the only way to say, "We remember. We see. We continue." After the ceremony, Daniel walked with Judge Sophie Dalton beneath the oak trees lining the school's courtyard. She had come without her robe, just a navy blouse, black slacks, and her familiar quiet poise. "You really don't like microphones, do you?" she teased. Daniel chuckled. "They're louder than I am. You're louder than most people without ever raising your voice." They stopped at a small plaque being installed near the entrance. It read, "The Brooks Justice Fellowship. For those who fight with integrity, serve with silence, and speak with truth." Sophie touched the edge of the bronze. "I meant what I said that day," she murmured. "You brought me back to the law I believed in when I first put on the robe." Daniel looked at her, more open than he had allowed himself to be since Beth. "You believed in it all along. You just needed someone to remind you." There was a long pause. Then Sophie asked quietly, "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Daniel turned toward the courtyard where Sam laughed with a few students. "I used to think justice was the destination," he said. "Now I think it's the road." Sophie smiled. "Then I guess we walk it." Together, they walked on. That evening back home, Daniel tucked Sam into bed. The boy looked up at him sleepy-eyed but thoughtful. "Dad, did Mom ever see you do something like this?" Daniel hesitated, then sat down at the edge of the bed. She saw me wear a uniform, he said. She saw me defend others overseas. But no, she didn't see this. He touched his son's hand. But I think she would have been proud of both of us. Sam smiled. Do you think people will forget someday? Daniel thought about that. The fleeting nature of headlines, the shallowness of fame. Then he shook his head. Not if we keep doing the right thing. Not if we keep helping people tell their stories. Sam nodded, satisfied. Okay, then I'll help. Daniel kissed the boy's forehead and turned off the lamp. Outside, the moon hung over the city like a quiet sentinel. In her apartment across town, Judge Dalton opened her journal, the one she had returned to ever since the trial. She wrote slowly. Justice is not a statue. It is not marble or granite. It is the single father with a voice full of memory. The child who still believes in dignity. The woman who remembers why she chose the law. She closed the book and turned off the light. And somewhere in the stillness, she smiled. Years later, the Brooks Justice Foundation would grow into one of the most respected legal outreach networks in the nation. It would train hundreds of veterans in legal advocacy, expand to 5 states, and even win a National Civic Medal of Honor. But for Daniel Brooks, his greatest victory never appeared in the press. It was this: one night walking home from work, he passed a courtroom where a young woman in uniform stood alone facing a long legal battle. She looked scared, overwhelmed. Daniel paused, stepped inside, and handed her his card. You don't have to do this alone. She blinked. Who are you? He smiled. No one important, he said, adjusting his green jacket. Just someone who stood when no one else would. Where are you watching from today? We'd love to know what part of the world you're in, and what part of this story spoke to you the most. If you found meaning in this journey, if it reminded you of someone, or made you pause and think, we invite you to subscribe to Soul Moments Story. There's more to come, stories of quiet strength, of kindness that changes lives, of justice that still matters. Thank you for spending your time with us today. It truly means more than you know.